What's up, everybody? So I knew the owner of this company would have to acknowledge it, release a statement, do something. If you run a zoo and somebody down the street is complaining about a lion in the backyard, it's kind of hard to say, well, yeah, but that's not our lion. A couple things about this real quick is it really angers me, the people out there that are trying to blame this on anybody in the government, but you can guess who they're trying to blame for it. I was very disappointed earlier to hear the guys from Due Dissonance repeating this. They fill in for Jimmy Dore quite a bit, and usually I think they're pretty good, but they're repeating the line, well, if Doge hadn't cut money for USAID, then there would have been funding for an alert system here. I really hope those guys were being sarcastic, but other people are not. So you're telling me that USAID has been handing out billions of dollars for 50 years, but this year, if they hadn't cut their funding, this year they were going to go down there and install an emergency alert system. Is that what you're telling me? Turning this into a political thing is absolutely pathetic. I just saw pictures of two of the little girls, beautiful girls. That's pathetic. Why don't we blame both of the Bushes? They're from Texas. They were in office for a combined 16 years and this never got done. And here's why. Nobody expected anything, ever expects anything like this. Look, this is the Guadalupe River in Texas. Here's me and Ruckus down at one of the 10,000 miles of rivers we have around here. So I'm not from Texas, but I know this terrain. My first job on the books was hauling canoes at a canoe rental in places like this. Everybody knows, Texas included, that you don't camp right on the river. You're always elevated a little bit. So if there is an increase in the water level, then you're fine. But 26 feet in 90 minutes is absolutely ridiculous, and nobody ever expects that. 10 or 15 feet is, you're not worried about a thing usually. But there are hundreds of thousands of campgrounds on rivers just like this with no alarm system because nobody ever expects anything on that magnitude. Here you can see where the Guadalupe River is and areas that they've been running these rain enhancement projects. And here's a talking head on NBC.
Is really this idea for farmers of like, hey, there's some moisture up there in the clouds. Is there a way that we can get it out of the clouds down here to the surface to help farmers? Because water vapor that's in the air needs something to grab onto, which is often like smaller than the tip of a pen. So you're thinking like pollens, particles of pollen or dust or even air pollution. So you see this graphic here. Basically what they do is they fly planes up there to give the water vapor something to grab onto. So it's a combination of silver iodide and salt actually. And so the water vapor forms around that. Eventually it gets heavy enough and then falls to the surface of rain. So when that happens, we're talking really small amounts of rain. In fact, scientists have been debating for decades whether or not this is actually very effective to do. So even when it does work, Gotti, we're not talking about a lot of rain, certainly not the amount of rain that they saw in Texas last.
Okay, so the guy straight out of Central Casting with an expert script on NBC says, yeah, it can only cause a little bit of rain. Okay, this is from the Office of the Historian, January 13th, 1967. Subject, weather mods in North Vietnam and Laos, Project Popeye. During the test phase, more than 50 seeding experiments were conducted. The results are viewed by DoD as outstandingly successful. 82% of the cloud seeded produced rain within a brief period after, a percentage appreciably higher than normal expectation in the absence of seeding. The amount of rainfall induced by this is believed to have been sufficient to have contributed substantially to rendering vehicle routes in this area inoperable. Since the end of the rainy season, the comrades have failed to undertake route repairs and there has been no vehicular traffic. So they were able to wash out the infrastructure with this. Now, there is a monsoon season there, and for this stuff to work, there has to be moisture in the air to nucleate, but not all of it would have dumped in this area. It could have just kept going over into the mountains. And that's why I don't like the whole thing, because what you're giving to one place is taking away from another. In one instance, the rainfall continued as the cloud moved eastward across the Vietnam border and inundated a Special Forces camp with 9 inches of rain in 4 hours. This experiment demonstrated a capacity to raise and maintain rainfall under controlled conditions to the level at which the land is saturated over a sustained period, slowing movement on foot and rendering the operation of vehicles impracticable. If anything, the tests were too successful. Neither the volume of induced rainfall nor the extent of area affected can be precisely predicted. So this has worked to an incredible degree since 1967. But that is the US government. What just happened down in Texas is a little company just called Rainmaker Corp, I believe. And I've shown how you could pull a license for this in like 1948 California. And this is what they do. They load up a Cessna with all of these torches behind them that burn as they're flying into a front and release the silver iodide. These aren't even the big commercial jets that we see all the spider webs coming from. They always talk about this being used for agriculture, but I think one of their biggest clients are the ski resorts in California. Evidently, they've been hiring them for years to ensure there's a good snowpack. You guys remember that grocery store ceiling that collapsed because of all the snow a couple years ago and the whole town was stranded? I wonder if that had been induced. But okay, here's what the owner of Rainmaker Corp says about this.
Cloud seeding, the best operations we've ever seen from either Rainmaker's own work or the National Center for Atmospheric Research or other institutions can produce tens of millions of gallons of precipitation distributed over hundreds of square miles over the course of about an hour or two. The remnants of Tropical Storm Barry that blew in and caused the flooding, that storm dumped trillions of gallons. It's about 1 million times less than what the biggest and best cloud seeding operations can do right now.
Okay, so he mentioned something there that I hadn't heard anybody else mention yet. Is this storm was the tail end of Tropical Storm Barry. So we'll get back to that in a minute.
July 2nd, we flew about a 20-minute flight where we seeded two small clouds with about 70 grams worth of silver iodide. That's about 10 Skittles worth of material. And those clouds dissipated about 2 hours after the event.
Any rain?
Yeah.
Okay. And they dissipated, and they don't remain up in the atmosphere, right?
The clouds,
the Skittles,
for one, the Skittles of material, they could not have stayed suspended in the atmosphere by the time that the flooding started happening.
Okay, and then the flood, that was a storm that rolls in and was not part of the system that you seeded, correct?
Correct. And also, it's worth noting that, a lot of people have said, well, this shouldn't go on without any oversight. And I totally agree. And I think that there should be even more regulatory scrutiny and oversight and reporting requirements so that these operations are totally transparent. But there actually are regulations in Texas through the Texas Department of Licensing and Regulation that have suspension criteria. And suspension criteria are these meteorological conditions, these weather conditions, these issuances and notifications from the National Weather Service that say, hey, if there is a flash flood warning, if the soil is already too saturated, if cloud seeding would cause any flooding, you have to suspend operations. And not only did we suspend operations in adherence with the regulations from the state of Texas, but we actually, because our meteorologists were very proactive, suspended operations a day in advance of any warnings that would have regulatorily mandated us to, because we at Rainmaker earnestly believe that this is God's kingdom to steward, and it is our job to do no harm and do as much good as we can. And so if we can bias towards being cautious, not so cautious that we ban this technology and prevent farmers from having water from it, but if we can be cautious in our operations such that we mitigate any potential for any damage, which we did and do, I'm all for that. That's what everybody's opinion is at my company.
Okay, so the last time they had done this was 2 days prior. So let's science this a little bit. I'm not sure if silver iodide is heavier or lighter than air. I'm assuming it's heavier, which would mean that any of it that didn't nucleate would sink its way down to the ground, right? Or if it's lighter than air, then it would just stay airborne indefinitely. But I've actually watched a lot of these, which I think is something altogether different. I've watched this enough. I know they weren't actually webbing out in front of a storm front coming through. They just do. This is just all the time. But even the most persistent of these that will stay pretty tight little white clouds for a long time, they blow out of sight within a couple hours. It's just like any other clouds. The upper atmosphere winds are constantly blowing. So if they were flying over these areas 2 days before, whatever was released would be Arkansas, Tennessee, 48 hours later. There's nothing you're going to do to stop the wind from blowing. Well, anything that's released up there is going to blow with the wind. or drop to the ground. Now, the day after the tragedy, the article I read said that they had predicted flash flooding for 4 days out in front of this. I just didn't know that it was the tail end of Tropical Storm Barry. But this is a huge front that had come in off the Gulf of America and yeah, sucked up trillions of tons of water. So if someone went out in front of this that was already predicted to be flash flooding and intentionally nucleated it, then that person would be an idiot and needs to be locked up. Now, one of the reasons this was so bad is that front did stall over Texas. And like I said in the last video, I don't think anybody has the technology to do that. You're talking about making the wind stop blowing. But if you were to intentionally have impregnated this storm, you would have had to have done it 2 days prior down in Mexico. Anything dumped in this area 2 days prior would have been pushed out by the front coming in. So, like I said in the last video, but I really doubt there's a whole team of people working on this just to flood out residential areas and harm innocent people. Now, Operation Popeye in Vietnam, yeah, they intentionally flooded areas. But I doubt you've got a bunch of Americans in America intentionally working on a project to hurt other Americans. Yeah, this is a small Texas company we're talking about, not the government. I don't put anything past them. They've got islands where they're breeding the next generation of operatives that they've screwed with their head since the day they were born. And they're able to keep their information compartmentalized to the point that nobody even realizes what the big picture is that they're working on. But this is an American company led by a Texas Christian who I seriously doubt would intentionally harm other Americans. And believe it or not, people who do startups like this are pretty smart people. And it doesn't take a genius to know that seeding the tail end of a hurricane is probably a bad idea. I read you guys the reports directly after the Dubai incident where their scientists said, yeah, we should have left that one alone. They screwed up. Now they lie and say that that's not what it was at all, but I read the original report at the time, and I'm sure this is a case study for anyone in that field now. These aren't secret black budget operations. It's a whole field of science now. So I know this technology can be used to a devastating effect, but I see zero motive for them to use it in any nefarious way. It's just a company. And anything that they released 2 days prior would either have fallen to the ground by then or been blown out. So I really don't think they had anything to do with this. I think it was a very unfortunate tragedy. And this was the tail end of a tropical storm with trillions of gallons of water. It stalled over that area and did something that nobody's seen in 100 years. But instead of explaining all this to everybody, just like I did, NBC would rather just get on there and lie and say, well, no, this technology can't do that. BS. They'll lie when the truth sounds better. And that's why nobody believes anything they say and automatically assumes the opposite. But like I said last video, they were forecasting potential flash flooding 4 days in advance of this, and it would be incredibly stupid to go up and mess with that in any way, and I don't think they did. And what they did 2 days prior, I think would have blown out or fell to the ground by then. That's just my take on things. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. I'll catch you on the next one. Static out.